Good day, good afternoon, good night, good whatever time. And good to see you once again. As we look to the coming sixth Sunday in Ordinary Time, Year B. And unfortunately, this time you have to try to read my handwriting rather than Nancy's very clear. So I'll have to read it out loud to you so that you can read it yourself. This is the response for this coming Sunday. I turn to you, Lord, in time of trouble, and you fill me with the joy of salvation. Two notes on salvation. Let's see if I've got a voice left to try to sing it with. It goes something like this. I sing to you, Lord, in time of trouble, and you fill me with the joy of salvation. I got through that limpingly. Let me try it again. I turn to you, Lord, in time of trouble, and you fill me with the joy of salvation. Want to try that, please? I turn to you, Lord, in time of trouble, and you fill me with the joy of salvation. Blessed is he whose fault is taken away, whose sin is covered. Blessed the man to whom the Lord imputes not guilt, in whose spirit there is no guile. I turn to you, Lord, in time of trouble, and you fill me with joy of salvation. Then I acknowledge my sin to you, my guilt I covered not. I said, I confess my faults to the Lord, and you took away the guilt of my sin. I turn to you, Lord, in time of trouble, and you fill me with the joy of salvation. And from the Gospel of Mark, we hear, a leper came to Jesus and, kneeling down, begged him and said, "If you wish, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand, touched him, and said to him, "I do will it. Be made clean." The leprosy left him immediately, and he was made clean. Then, warning him sternly, he dismissed him at once. He said to him, "See that you tell no one anything, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses prescribed. That will be proof for them." The man went away and began to publicize the whole matter. He spread the report abroad so that it was impossible for Jesus to enter a town openly. He remained outside in deserted places, and people kept coming to him from everywhere. Let us pray. O God, who teach us that you abide in hearts that are just and true, grant that we may be so fashioned by your grace as to become a dwelling pleasing to you. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, God forever and ever. I turn to you, Lord, in time of trouble, and you fill me with the joy of salvation. Be glad in the Lord, and rejoice, you just. Exult, all you upright of heart. I turn to you, Lord, in time of trouble, and you fill me with the joy of salvation. Very good. Thank you. Now, let's get to work. Perhaps this gospel is one that is very important for us to understand because it's the healing of a leper. And again, in picking up some of the thematic elements that I've been talking about recently, and especially about the healing of Jesus, it's not just Jesus feeling sorry for somebody. It says that he's moved with pity, but we'll look at that in greater detail when we get to the gospel. But in order to understand how important this healing of a leper is, that's why the first reading is taken from the book of Leviticus. Now, Leviticus we don't often hear. And when we gather on Sundays or during the week, we don't often hear because it is the Levites. Leviticus means a book that belongs to the Levites. The Levites were the priests. That the tribe of Levi was set aside and was not one of the 12 regular tribes, but the tribe of Levi was set aside specifically to serve as priests. And Moses and his brother Aaron were the tribe of Levi. And Aaron was the one who especially exercised that priestly role, what we see particularly in the book of Exodus. And in the book of Leviticus, there's a whole important section of the book of Leviticus that talks about the ordination of Aaron. That is how he is established as the priest. And so Leviticus the book is dedicated to lots of laws, regulations, dealing with worship, with liturgy, and with requirements for the Levites. And it generally is not terribly, it is generally of not general interest. And especially we get a hint of that from the first reading from the book of Leviticus. Now, let me read that reading, and you'll see what I mean. Then your ears will be prepared to hear this reading from the book of Leviticus on Sunday this coming Sunday, and you won't be terribly shocked by it, but you'll be ready for it. The first reading goes, "The Lord said to Moses and to Aaron," remember, "of the tribe of Levi," therefore the priestly caste, "if someone has on his skin a scab or pustule or blotch, which appears to be the sore of leprosy, he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of the priests among his descendants. If the man is leprous and unclean, the priest shall declare him unclean by reason of the sore on his head. The one who bears the sore of leprosy shall keep his garment rent," torn, "and his head bare, and shall muffle his beard. He shall cry out, 'Unclean, unclean!' As long as the sore is on him, he shall declare himself unclean, since he is in fact unclean. He shall dwell apart, making his abode outside the camp." Well, that's that's pretty harsh. And the person is made to live outside the camp, and the importance of the community, that Exodus community, Leviticus comes before the book of Exodus, Leviticus comes in a certain sense as presumptively before the book of Exodus, but it governs all the time of the wandering in the desert. Oh, and by the way, don't forget we have the prayer and pondering points, and now we're taking a look at the reflections, the outline for the reflections. So, in taking a look at the book of Leviticus, there are usual kinds of questions that we can have in analyzing or looking at some of the books of Scripture. We ask, who wrote it? Who is the author? In this instance, we ask, who are the authors? Because there are many different sources for the book of Leviticus. And the response to the question is a question mark. It is unknown who the authors are. It seems as though they probably came about, the works that are found in the book of Leviticus were all kind of collected after the exile. Remember, Exodus might have been around the year maybe 1200 or something like that. And after the exile is around 500 and something. So quite a bit of period of time in between. But that date is when things were collected and put into a kind of final form. Its title refers to this being directed toward the priestly caste of the Levites. And its literary form is like a liturgical manual. The do's and don'ts, the things that, the reason for the emphasis on the unclean in the first reading that we had is because ritual purity was important before entering worship. And there were many things that could render one unclean. For example, remember the story, the parable that Jesus told of the Good Samaritan. A man fell among robbers, was left by the side of the road, beaten, and a priest and a scribe or Levite went by and didn't stop to help him. Now, was it just because they were arrogant? No. They were conscientious about maintaining their purity to lead the public worship at the temple. Because to have contact with blood would be to make them unclean. That's in the book of Leviticus. So they were just maintaining their purity so that they could worship. And so this whole story about leprosy, for example, that we have from the book of Leviticus is about that uncleanness. It's ritual purity that is necessary for the worship, because otherwise the worship itself would be corrupted. Now, we must keep that in mind as we go along and take a look at not only leprosy then, but also leprosy later on, and how we can understand those sorts of things today. So toward the end of the book of Leviticus, there's a whole holiness code. There is, in the Christian tradition, there is a kind of holiness doctrine that, to borrow from, who is it, Roy Orbison? And mess it up a little bit, is only the holy, rather than only the lonely, but only the holy are allowed in. And we get kinds of tastes of that from time to time with worrying about who shows up at church. We want only the holy there, or only those who know that they aren't holy and are properly aware of it. They don't impose their unholiness on the rest of us. Or another way is, especially can come about with younger folks who don't want to be with all those hypocrites. They have a kind of holiness doctrine, in a sense, somewhat upside over, that all these sinners gather together. So why join with those hypocrites? They don't practice what they say they do. And we are meant to recognize our unworthiness, but that we also recognize the healing power of Christ. So Catholics don't have a holiness doctrine. There used to be a church, I lived when I was growing up, on the corner of 3rd and Gum. So it was about 7 blocks out from 702 East 3rd. It was 7 blocks out from Washington, the corner of Washington and 3rd. And about a block and a half, I think it was, up 3rd from Washington, on the right-hand side, there was a house that had been turned into a church. And it said Pilgrim Holiness Church. And I don't know for sure, but looking back on it, I think that was one of those churches that had that holiness doctrine. That the only people who could come there to worship had to be holy, had to be saved, had to be purified of sin. No sinners allowed. Now, why do we have this particular text with all this about pustules and blotches and sores? Well, the reason, and I should note that there are lots of, this is, you know, from Leviticus chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, and 44, 46. What are those verses in between? Well, those verses in between get pretty specific at times about the whole process of determining what was clean and unclean. And also, more extended in this section of Leviticus, is about unclean garments, unclean houses, where a whole house, a whole garment, where there was some kind of mold or mildew or something that threatened the wearer or threatened the those who lived in the house, and so they were declared unclean and no one could use them. But the detail in those intervening verses is pretty awful, so I'm glad that they are not included. The notion of leprosy in Leviticus and in Jewish tradition is of a condition that is visible and that is presumed to be highly contagious. Now, and highly threatening to the health, the well-being, the wholeness, and the purity, the ritual purity of the whole community. So these conditions were very threatening to the life of the community. And also, because of that idea of ritual purity, also leprosy, this notion of leprosy, and also disease in general was often associated with sin. Sin being that disruption of relationship with God, an ailment, a lack of health in the relationship with God and the community. And so leprosy was a kind of a particularly powerful sign of that lack of good relationship, good healthy relationship with God and with others. And so there's connection of sin, both personal and communal, and also the punishment. So the suffering, the disbanding from the community, making them call unclean, unclean, leper's bell, to ring the bell, to warn the community away from the leper. All those things were a form of punishment that was associated with sin and with disease, particularly leprosy. Now, the tie-in into the gospel is taking that Jewish condition, the Jewish understanding, and recognizing, as I said before, that Jesus' healing is not just Jesus being nice, being kind. Unfortunately, we have taken over the course of, especially I think here in the United States, we've taken the word Christian to mean nice. I think I mentioned this before, but it struck me at the time of the peace talks between Egypt and Israel, when they were going on back at Camp David, that an elected official in Washington, D.C. said, why can't these people just get along like good Christians? In other words, why can't they be nice to one another? Well, unfortunately, they were getting along like Christians that we've done over and over again through history, fighting with one another and not being peaceful. Now, so the tie of the gospel, and we'll see this develop a little bit more later on. We'll come to the gospel. Now remember, these texts and this notion of healing being a healing, not just a physical healing, but a healing from, especially from sin. This comes, remember that next Wednesday, a week from today, is Ash Wednesday, and we will be starting Lent. So this Sunday, and the readings this Sunday, are already helping us look toward the fundamental healing that Jesus means to bring, that we enter into with Lent, looking toward Easter. Now, the response, I turn to you, Lord, in time of trouble, and you fill me with the joy of salvation. There we have the tie-in between the trouble and the need of the first reading and how Jesus responds in the gospel. We have the two tied together. And in the psalm, it talks about, blessed is he whose fault is taken away, whose sin is covered. It goes on to say, then I acknowledge my sin to you, my guilt I covered not. So it's covered earlier on, and then I'm not the one covering it. Though, looking at the very notion of leprosy, one of the things that they had to do was, like muffling the beard, they had to cover themselves, to take themselves away out of the sight of the rest of the community. They had to be out of sight, and in a certain sense, out of mind. But here in the response, it is the in my guilt, I don't cover up my leprosy. I don't cover up my fault. I don't cover up my guilt. But my guilt, my leprosy, my sin is covered, can be covered by God. I can recover because of God. So, in Psalm 32, our response is taken from Psalm 32, is one of the 7 penitential psalms. That is, Psalm 32, it's Psalm 6, 38, 51, 102, 130, 143. These are the psalms that help us, particularly at times when, maybe when we want to celebrate the sacrament of reconciliation. They can be good for us during the time of Lent, as we look for ways that we can experience and renew our conversion. These psalms can be very helpful for those on their way to the Easter sacraments. The catechumens, who on the first Sunday of Lent can become the elect as they enter their final stage of preparation for the Easter sacraments. But notice how these penitential aspects are within the context of be glad in the Lord and rejoice, you just. Exult, all you upright of heart. It's the context of joy because of the dependence on God's wonderful and healing response. Now, remember that the second reading is a Lectio Continua. That is a continuous reading from the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. And in year A, as well at this time. There's a reading from 1 Corinthians, but it's from the earlier section. This is more from the middle on. And so in this particular part of Corinthians, well, listen to it. This is what St. Paul says. He says, brothers and sisters, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do everything for the glory of God. Avoid giving offense, whether to the Jews or Greeks or the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in every way, not seeking my own benefit, but that of the many, that they may be saved. Be imitators of me, as I am of Christ. And so, Paul sets up a contrast between the strong and the weak. And that's a constant concern of his. And he especially puts it forward in our reading today. And one of the ways he does this, specifically today, it's the question of, in the context of food sacrificed to idols. St. Paul said, food sacrificed to idols doesn't make any difference, because we know that the idols are empty, and if the food's available, fine. But, he says, because there are some who are weak and who see that as participating in that pagan worship, he says, skip it. Don't do it. Even though it's all right, don't do it. So, what he's saying is, in concern for others, that he says, brothers and sisters, whether you eat or drink, whatever, there's one principle that should always be more basic. So he's not getting into casuistry. You know that word, casuistry? I think I've used it before, but I'm about to use it again. Casuistry, you can see in the word itself, casuistry, it talks about cases. And that's one way of dealing with moral questions. It's quite a good way of dealing with moral questions. But what can happen is casuistry can end up, it doesn't need to, end up in heedless argumentation. I'm not much of a moral theologian. That was Father Riley's field, and he was great in moral theology. Me, not so much. However, on occasion, I've had to teach moral theology in some way or other. And one of the reasons I'm not fond of casuistry is it reminds me of, well, I think, I don't know if I've used this here, but I've used this example before of, one time I was babysitting my sister's kids, and I don't know how many there were at the time, 5, 6, 7, whatever. And I was in one part of the house, and a fight broke out in the other part. So I went running to find out what was going on. And I made the mistake of asking, who started this? Well, he said, but he was looking at me, and he took my phone, and he wouldn't let me, and she wouldn't do it. That could have gone on until we got to Adam and Eve. That's, in a sense, that's casuistry. That is, taking the case and saying, but what if this, and what if that, and well, if you change this part, well then, you never get to the end. And so, I was never very good at casuistry, and that was one of my first indications that I wasn't when confronting the kids about who started this. So, what Paul does is he doesn't go into casuistry to discuss the case, but rather settles on principle. What's the principle? And what the principle is do everything for the glory of God. That's the principle. Try to stick to that principle and make application of it in specific cases. And he went further. And at the very end, another principle. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. There you go. All we have to do is do that, and we're good. Now, the problem is, and here we're going to start talking about the gospel. Taking a look at this notion of leprosy, and in looking at it kind of in cultural context, okay? Again, from Leviticus, we have the sense that leprosy is not just about being contagious, but it's about pollution. It's not just kind of external, but there's something internal that is corrupt. And that relates to the whole purity, ritual purity kind of notion. Therefore, no cure, no care. Set them aside. Get rid of them. Don't deal with them. That's the best way to deal with them. Put everything outside. Defense and elimination were taken care of. Now, we see that in something like xenophobia. That's fear of the unknown and rejection of the unfit. That the sense that the other is a threat. And in our family, half German, half Italian, well, I was born in 1938. In the Second World War, we, the U.S., were at war with the Axis powers, included Germany and Italy. So, in some ways, there was less than welcome, in some ways, for someone with that kind of background. Xenophobia, fear of the unknown, the threat of the unknown, and so rejection. But also, the church had a way of dealing with some of those things, and that was what excommunication was, to ban someone from communion. Not only was it a declaration that someone was not in communion, but it made sure that there was not a threat to the community. And it was about, I think it was early 15th century, I don't remember for sure, exact date. But one of the popes took the notion of excommunication and went to another step. So someone was declared to be excommunicated vitandus. Vitandus, which means to be avoided. So it was have nothing to do with those folks. It was considered, and that was eventually, by the time we got to the revision of the code that was initiated by Pope John at the same time that he called for the council and for the synod in Rome back in 1959, that until that revision took place, the only, you might say, normal vitandus was someone who laid violent hands on the Pope. That person was to be avoided. If the person went in somewhere where there was a liturgy going on, they had to quit. That's severe. Then there are ways of dealing with that. In Rome, there was the borghetto. The borghetto was a little, in Rome there were various borghi. A borgo was a neighborhood, and a little neighborhood was a borghetto. And there was a borghetto that eventually they just called it the ghetto, Ghetto. Of course, that borghetto was the ghetto where the Jews lived. It's still recognized, and we can still go there, and there's some wonderful restaurants there that continue Italian, Jewish culinary arts. Very good. Highly recommended. But a ghetto was a place where it became for Jews to begin with, and then it became any place of isolation of certain groups, people living in a ghetto. The debtors' prisons. You got rid of the problem, these debtors that were just drawing everybody down, by putting them in prison, where they couldn't repay anyway, so just keep them apart from the rest of all this, and often the way the poor can be treated. They're poor, so keep them away from those who are normal people. But knowledge and understanding, and especially in terms of the church's social teaching, develop slowly to better understanding. You might say modern English, modern Catholic social teaching really began with Pope Leo XIII at the end of the 19th century, when he wrote Rerum Novarum, a marvelous social teaching that has been commemorated over and over again in the course of the last 100+ years. And so social programs began to be much more readily apart, and also one of the things was there was always in the church a care for others. Look at somebody like St. Francis, above all, someone like that. Can't think of his name. Oh, St. Camillus de Lillis, buried in Rome, who was the founder of, they're called after Camillus, the chameleons, but they're not chameleons, they're chameleons. And they are founded specifically to care for the poor, the sick poor. And Hansen's disease was finally understood as, even after the leper colonies, especially we know about those because in our own tradition, because of St. Damien and of St. Mary Ann Cope. St. Damien, who, from Belgium, who went to the leper colony in Kalapapa on the island of Molokai, and there dwelt with, lived with, and ministered to the lepers until he was able to tell them that he too was a leper, and he died as a leper and is a saint. And St. Mary Ann Cope came also to serve and to care in his last days with for St. Damien. And we know that Hansen's disease, we understand, can be dealt with, and it isn't contagious as it has had thought to be in the old days. In the old days, the lepers of the Hawaiian Islands were taken to this flat land at the base of towering cliffs on the island of Molokai, dumped, and they're left to fend for themselves until St. Damien came along. And so now we have ways to treat Hansen's disease, and it doesn't have the same terrible fear that it did before. I have a story about a leper that I met in Thailand, but I'm not going to tell it now. But also, one of the things that strikes me is excommunicatus vitandus, this shunning of the Catholic Church, is something that Pope Francis is trying to help us overcome. But he's run into all kinds of problems, because he published a little document by the name of Fiducia Supplicans, seeking faith, seeking trust. And in it, he talked about giving blessing to couples who were not in a regular union, like man and woman, who might be a question of divorce and remarried without benefit and annulment, or living together who would ask for a blessing, the Catholics. And he says that's possible to do. But also those in an irregular union, like two men or two women together. Well, Pope Francis has gotten into all kinds of trouble because of that. Because we can't bless those unions. He's not saying bless those unions. He's saying bless those people. We're not to, and yet the way we have treated so many folks, Catholics in the old days, because in the U.S. Church, if you were divorced and remarried, you were excommunicated. That didn't happen in the rest of the world. Here in the U.S., it was a formal excommunication, and the reason was, in the U.S., the Catholics were overwhelmed by the non-Catholic world in which they lived, non-Catholic culture in which they lived. And so it was felt that this was a way to help guard against more of that kind of thing happening. Well, it was eventually removed as excommunication. It's no longer a formal excommunication. comparatively recently, a few years ago. And what Pope Francis is talking about is how, and especially one of the things that happened in so many families, as well as Catholic families, that if there's someone who found himself or herself to be a homosexual orientation, how often they were shunned, like excommunicatus vitantus. What Pope Francis is doing is saying, what can we do to overcome that shunning aspect? How can we, because we bless anybody who asks, we don't check their Catholic credentials. We bless those who ask. And what happens is, in the gospel, the man says, the leper says, if you wish, that is, if you will, you can, you have the power to heal, to clean, to cleanse. And the response, Jesus, is, I do will it. I will be cleansed. Now, be made clean, is sometimes known as a theological or divine passive. What that means is put the passive voice, be cleansed. He doesn't say, I cleanse you. He says, be clean. That's called the theological passive, because it means God does it. And, of course, especially Christ, being God, does it. And it says, in our translation, it says that he is moved with pity. And what the word is in Greek, and I'm sure you remember this, is splanknistheis. And splanknistheis is that word in Greek that has as its root splankna, which means this part, the deepest, most human part, in my case, ever growing. And yet it's a word that means compassion, and it's a word that's used only of the compassion of God in the New Testament. And so when it says that Jesus has compassion, looks on him with pity. Pity is a hard word in English because I think especially in American English, it has a tendency to convey a sense of superiority or kind of arrogance, looking with pity on somebody, looking down on somebody. But here it means that kind of compassion that belongs to God. It's a powerful and wonderful word. The other examples in Mark, and notice they're here, chapter 6, verse 34, he looked at them as like sheep without a shepherd, and he looked upon them with compassion, and he began to teach them at length. In the feeding the 4,000, in chapter 8, verse 2, he looked upon them with compassion. And in chapter 9, verse 22, when the man says, I believe, help my unbelief, Jesus looked upon him with compassion. So, profoundly human word for, and exclusively in the New Testament, divine compassion. Then it also says this extraordinary thing. He touched him. Well,
That's completely contrary to all the meanings and expectations and understandings and demands of the law. Lepers you don't get anywhere near them. They brought you contagion. They polluted you. You became unclean. You became impure. But Jesus touched the man. And healed him, cleansed him, made him pure, brought him back into the community. But notice how he said, go show yourselves to the priest. And that will be proof. To make sure that everyone knows that you are clean, show them what I have done for you. And it says, warned him, dismissed him, tell no one, and the guy blabbed. Now, the reason Jesus did this is part of, in Mark's gospel, what's referred to as the messianic secret. The scholars mean by that Jesus is concerned that the crowds will see him as a regal Messiah, as a militaristic Messiah, as the one to come who will reestablish them in their glory, that he will be like King David and establish a kingdom and overcome all their enemies, including kicking out the Romans, of course. Because many of the messianic expectations had come to mean deliverance from that kind of oppression, political oppression. And the man began to publicize. And the word for publicize there in Greek is kerusein, which is, we get the word kerygma from. And a kerygma is a proclamation. And we talk about kerygmatic, not charismatic, but kerygmatic theology. That is a theology centered on the notion of the proclamation of the coming of the good news, of the proclamation of the good news. And so, even though the man blabbed, he was doing it as a proclamation. He proclaimed it everywhere. He began to publicize it. And so, Jesus, because the people looking for that kind of particular Messiah they wanted, had ended up in deserted places. And people kept coming to him from everywhere. So, I hope that these reflections might help a little bit this next Sunday in coming to hear these scriptures and hear above all the extraordinary power of the message of the cleansing of the leper, especially as we look forward to Lent that is almost on us. See you Sunday.